Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and dripping with disdain, cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. Jack Miller didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. At 78, he had learned to pick his battles, and this one, a sneer from a young lieutenant, wasn't worth the effort. The young man, Lieutenant Thompson, stood a few rows ahead, eyeing Jack with the same kind of arrogance that only youth and inexperience could bring. What's a guy like him doing on a flight like this? Probably here for some cheap vacation. His words were loud enough for his buddies to hear, and they snickered in unison, amused by their own cruelty. Jack could hear them, feel the weight of their laughter, but it didn't bother him. After all, he had survived worse. He had earned the right to be ignored. In his mind, he wasn't just some old man with faded jeans and a wrinkled shirt. No, he was something more, something these young men would never understand. As Jack sat quietly in seat 16A, a small, tarnished pin gleamed faintly on his lapel, barely visible. It was the only sign of who he really was. A simple piece of metal, but one with a history that none of the young men could ever hope to match. As the plane hummed along at 30,000 feet, the young men laughed louder, oblivious to the storm of memories that were beginning to stir in Jack's mind. He closed his eyes, the noise of the cabin fading as he slipped into the past. Vietnam. The jungle. The heat. The fear. The sound of rotor blades slicing through the air. His mind shifted gears, his hands clenched in the seat's armrests, and the years melted away. It was the kind of memory that never left you. He remembered the moment he had saved a young pilot, David Foster, whose life had been on the line. Jack had flown with him, patched him up, and gotten him back into the fight. Foster had given Jack that pin. It wasn't official, but it was more than any medal could ever be. It was a bond, a promise. Jack had never taken it off. "Hey, Grandpa, are you listening to me?" Lieutenant Thompson's voice snapped Jack back into the present. He opened his eyes, still calm. Thompson was now standing directly in front of him, a smug look on his face. "What? You gonna tell me your rank? Or are you just gonna sit there looking like an old man who's forgotten everything?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn, leather-bound wallet. As he opened it, the light caught the pin, and something in the young lieutenant shifted. The arrogance in Thompson's eyes flickered for just a second, but it was enough. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something familiar about that pin. Something important. As the lieutenant walked away, he muttered to himself, "Who the hell is this guy?" But Jack didn't need to answer. He had already proved more than enough. The captain, who had been quietly observing, leaned in, whispering to Thompson, "Do you know who that is?" Thompson frowned, confused. "Who?" "That's Dragon 6. The legendary Vietnam pilot." The words hit like a thunderclap, and suddenly, the energy in the cabin changed. The whispers started, spreading like wildfire through the flight crew, until it reached the cockpit. Jack's call sign, Dragon 6. The very name had made enemies freeze in their tracks. The young men, so quick to judge, now had no words. Thompson looked back at Jack, realizing too late the depth of his mistake. The realization struck him harder than anything. The old man, sitting so quietly in seat 16A, had earned the respect that these young men had never thought to give. And now, as the plane cruised on, Jack's quiet presence commanded more attention than any boastful story could ever hope to achieve. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as the realization spread. Dragon 6. The name lingered in the air, carrying the weight of decades of untold stories and unacknowledged heroism. Jack Miller sat in his seat, eyes closed, as if he hadn't heard the whispers, but he knew. He always knew. It was the name given to him not for what he did on paper, but for the lives he had saved, the risks he had taken when others would have turned away. He had never sought the recognition, never looked for praise. But in the quiet of his solitude, he had earned the respect of those who mattered most. He had walked away from the war, leaving the medals behind and the spotlight behind him. But he had never left the mission. His hands, now gnarled with age, still carried the weight of all he had done. As the flight continued, Jack felt the shift in energy around him. The young men who had once mocked him were now watching him from a distance, unsure how to address the man they had misjudged so completely. Lieutenant Thompson, who had been so confident just moments ago, was now looking at his feet, avoiding Jack's gaze. It wasn't just the name, it was what that name meant. It meant surviving what others couldn't, It meant leading when no one else would. And it meant being part of something bigger than oneself, even when that something was a distant memory for everyone else. Jack opened his eyes slowly, his gaze landing on the young lieutenant. Thompson still stood, shifting awkwardly in place, unsure of himself now. Jack's eyes, once steely in the face of battle, now seemed to pierce through the young man. But there was no anger in Jack's expression, no malice. Just the calm, quiet presence of someone who had seen too much to be shaken by the petty judgments of youth. "You okay, Lieutenant?" Jack's voice was soft, but there was a weight to it, like a command without the force behind it. Thompson didn't answer immediately. The question hung in the air for a moment before he nodded, still fumbling with his thoughts. "Yeah, I'm fine." Jack nodded, a small, knowing smile pulling at the corners of his lips. Good. The tension was thick, but there was no need for more words. Jack had nothing to prove. He had already proved it. In the back of the plane, the flight attendants exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to handle the sudden shift in atmosphere. It wasn't often that you had a real legend on a commercial flight, someone whose presence changed the air in the room without them needing to say a single word. Jack sat back in his seat, his hands folding over his lap, the worn leather of his jacket creaking softly as he adjusted. The pin on his lapel caught the light again, the faint gleam of it more powerful now than it had ever been. To these young men, it was just a symbol, a small, worn piece of metal. But to Jack, it was a reminder of who he had been and who he still was. The rest of the flight went in silence. The flight attendants moved around, the sound of the plane's engines humming in the background, but Jack's seat remained untouched by the triviality of the world around him. The name, the call sign, was now out there. And as the plane landed and the crew made their way off, Jack stayed seated for a moment longer. He wasn't in any hurry. After all, for someone like him, the world had always moved at its own pace. The plane taxied slowly toward the terminal, the wheels squeaking faintly as it made its way down the runway. Jack Miller remained seated, his hands resting calmly on his lap, eyes fixed on the window, though his thoughts were far from the view of the busy airport. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the past, in memories that never seemed to fade. As the plane came to a complete stop, the seatbelt sign blinked off, and the usual bustle of passengers getting ready to disembark began. Jack remained still, as he always did, waiting for the world to catch up with him. He was never in a rush. The young pilots, still unsure of what to do with the weight of their realization, shuffled out of their seats, avoiding his gaze. Lieutenant Thompson, the one who had been so quick to mock, glanced back one last time, his face pale as he walked past Jack's seat. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just the quiet hum of regret hanging in the air. Jack didn't mind. He wasn't here for apologies. He never had been. As the last of the flight crew disembarked, Jack stood up slowly, gathering his belongings. He moved with the same careful precision that had carried him through the toughest of situations. His movements were deliberate, controlled, the kind that came with years of practice and understanding. When his feet finally touched the terminal floor, the weight of the past seemed to ease, if only for a moment. He was just another passenger now, blending in with the crowd. But not everyone would forget. As he walked toward the baggage claim, a voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me, sir?" Jack turned, his eyes settling on a young woman in a sharp suit, her expression a mix of curiosity and recognition. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Jack Miller?" Jack paused, his gaze steady but unbothered. "That's me," he said simply, not needing to add anything more. The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I'm a reporter. I've heard stories about you. The Dragon 6 from Vietnam, right? I've read about you in the papers. You're a legend." Jack's expression softened, but only just. He wasn't surprised. It happened every now and then. People recognized the name, but they didn't always know the man behind it. "I've been called worse," Jack said, his voice dry with years of experience. The woman smiled nervously, not sure how to proceed. "Could I ask you a few questions? I mean, the things you've done, it's incredible. The stories, they're all about the heroism, the medals, the battles. But I want to know about you, the man behind the stories." Jack looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. He could tell she was genuine, but he wasn't sure she was ready for the truth. He had learned long ago that some stories were better left untold. The stories you read in the papers, they're just that, stories, Jack said, his voice low. The real stories, they're not the ones people write about. They're the ones you live with, day after day. They don't make the headlines, and they sure as hell don't get you medals. But they're the ones that stay with you, long after everyone else has forgotten. The woman seemed to sense the shift in the air, and for a moment, she hesitated. But then, a faint nod of understanding passed between them. She wasn't going to push. "Thank you," she said softly. Jack gave a small nod of his own, then turned and continued toward the baggage claim, the sound of his boots against the floor steady and unyielding. As he walked, the weight of his past, his legacy, followed quietly behind him. It was something that never truly left, no matter how much time passed. But for now, at least, it was something he could carry on his own terms. Jack walked through the bustling terminal, the noise of passengers and announcements blending into the background. He moved with the same deliberate pace, a rhythm that had served him well over the years. There was no rush. For a man who had spent most of his life moving between life and death, between chaos and order, time was a luxury he no longer needed to chase. As he reached the baggage claim, the familiar hum of the conveyor belt filled the air. Jack's eyes scanned the crowd, noticing the young families, the business people, the tourists, all lost in their own little worlds. No one recognized him here, and that was fine. He had never sought out the attention. He wasn't the type of man who thrived on applause. His reward had always been something more quiet, something that didn't fit neatly into a headline or a magazine article. Jack's bag appeared on the conveyor, and he walked over to retrieve it, his old leather suitcase worn with time, but still holding the memories of countless places, of countless lives. As he hoisted it from the belt, he felt the familiar weight settle in his hand, a weight that had become a part of him over the years. The woman who had approached him earlier was still standing near the terminal's coffee stand, watching him from a distance. Jack didn't acknowledge her, but he could feel her gaze, just as he had felt the eyes of the young pilots on the plane. He had become used to being observed, but not necessarily understood. He wasn't sure why she had asked him about his past. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, something that went beyond just reporting the stories. She had seen the pin, heard the whispers, and now she wanted to know the man behind the legend. But some things, Jack knew, weren't meant to be shared. Not everything needed to be known. He had lived through enough to understand that the past was like a shadow, always following but never truly seen. He didn't need to relive it for anyone else's benefit. He had already done that, 1,000 times in his mind. Jack moved through the crowd toward the exit, the doors sliding open to the bright sunshine of the outside world. The fresh air hit his face, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. There was something about the freedom of it, something simple and pure, that he hadn't realized he missed. The world outside was different now, but in a way, it was the same. People rushed by, their lives moving at a pace he no longer kept up with. He was content with his slower pace, his quieter life. As Jack made his way to the parking lot, the sound of footsteps behind him broke his moment of peace. He turned to see the young reporter, the woman from the terminal, walking quickly to catch up. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Miller," she began, I just wanted to say, thank you. For your service, for everything. I didn't mean to intrude earlier. I've heard so much about you. I never imagined I'd meet you in person." Jack stopped and turned to face her, his gaze steady. "You didn't intrude," he said simply. "But sometimes, the stories you hear, they're not the whole truth. They never are. People hear the medals, the call signs, the glory, but they never hear about the days when the medals didn't matter. When the call signs didn't mean a damn thing. Those days stay with you. They don't get written down, and they don't get shared." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "I understand," she said quietly. Jack gave her a small, knowing smile. "Good. Now, I'm not much for crowds. So, I think it's best I take my leave." With that, he turned and walked toward his car, leaving the reporter standing there, her thoughts swirling. Jack didn't look back. He didn't need to. His past was his own, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like it was finally enough. Jack pulled his car into the small parking lot, the engine purring to a stop as he killed the ignition. He sat there for a moment, the silence enveloping him, the weight of his past still lingering in the quiet air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow across the horizon. It had been a long time since he had felt the need to be anywhere, to do anything. The days were slipping by, quiet and unremarkable, just the way he liked it. He grabbed his bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He took a deep breath, the familiar scent of the world around him grounding him. There was something soothing about the simplicity of it all. The small town, the fading light, the distant hum of life moving on without him. Jack walked toward the modest house at the end of the block, the one he had called home for the last few years. It wasn't much, just a two-story place with a small yard and a porch that had seen better days. But it was his. The house was a reflection of who he was now. A man who had seen too much, done too much, and was ready for nothing more than peace. As he reached the front door, Jack paused for a moment, his hand resting on the old wooden frame. He could hear the faint sound of a dog barking in the distance, a neighbor's car driving by, the soft rustling of leaves in the trees. It was the kind of peaceful evening he had always hoped for. He opened the door, stepping inside, and immediately the familiar smell of old books and leather greeted him. His small library of war stories, history books, and novels lined the shelves, just as it always had. It was his sanctuary. Jack set his bag down on the small table by the door, and as he did, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from the reporter. "Mr. Miller, I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to speak with me. I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable. Your story is one that needs to be told. I hope you'll consider sharing it with the world someday." Jack stared at the message for a moment, his finger hovering over the screen. He thought about responding, but then he just set the phone down on the table, choosing silence instead. He had already shared enough. The world didn't need more of him. It had already gotten everything it was going to get. Jack walked into the living room and settled into his favorite chair by the window. Outside, the sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. The sky was a rich tapestry of reds and pinks, the stars just beginning to show themselves in the vastness of the evening. He didn't know how much longer he would stay in this house, in this town. But for now, it was enough. He could feel the weight of the years lifting, slowly, steadily. Maybe, just maybe, he could finally start to let go. Jack closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. The world outside kept spinning, people kept living their lives, and he was content to just be. For the first time in years, he was content to simply be. The days began to blur together for Jack. The small town, the quiet life, everything felt like a dream, a life he had built for himself after all the years spent in chaos. Each morning, he woke up to the same sounds, the birds outside his window, the distant hum of cars driving down the road, the soft buzz of a nearby lawnmower. It was peaceful. It was ordinary. But for Jack, that was more than enough. He spent his mornings with a cup of coffee, sitting on his porch and watching the world move by at a pace that suited him. People walked their dogs, waved hello, and went about their daily routines, unaware of the man sitting quietly at the edge of it all. Jack had never been one to seek out the spotlight. In fact, he had always preferred the shadows, where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. He had done his part. His name, his call sign, would forever echo in the history of those who knew what it meant. But now, in the stillness of this small town, Jack was just a man, nothing more, nothing less. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch, a car pulled up to the curb. Jack looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't expecting anyone. The car stopped, and the door opened. The young reporter, the one who had approached him weeks earlier, stepped out. She paused for a moment, looking up at the house, then made her way toward the porch. Jack didn't stand up. He just watched her approach, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice a little tentative. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Jack nodded slowly, gesturing to the chair beside him. "You're fine," he said, his voice steady. She sat down, her notebook still in hand, but she didn't immediately start asking questions. Instead, she just sat there beside him, staring out at the quiet street. They sat in silence for a while, both of them lost in their thoughts. Jack could feel the weight of her curiosity, but he wasn't in a hurry to feed it. "I know this might seem strange," the woman said finally, breaking the silence. "But I've been thinking about our conversation, about your story. The things you've done, they matter, Mr. Miller. They matter more than you realize." Jack looked at her then, his eyes soft but intense. They mattered then, he said, but it's different now. The world has moved on, and so have I. The woman seemed to understand, nodding slowly. I get it, she said, but I still think your story deserves to be told. The world needs to hear it. People need to understand what it really means to serve, to sacrifice. Jack shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. People think they want to hear stories like mine, but they don't. They want the glory, the medals, the accolades. They don't want the quiet moments, the pain that comes with it. The ones who understand, they don't need to hear it. They already know. The reporter was silent for a moment, processing his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft. Maybe you're right. Maybe some stories are better left untold. But that doesn't mean they don't matter. Jack didn't respond right away. He just sat there, looking out over the street. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was the end of another day, just like so many before it. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt content. He wasn't seeking recognition. He wasn't searching for meaning. He had already found it, long ago, in the quiet moments between the chaos. The reporter stood up, her notebook still in hand. I won't take up any more of your time, she said, giving him a small smile. Thank you for speaking with me, Mr. Miller. Jack nodded, watching her walk back to her car. As she drove away, he turned back to his porch, feeling the familiar weight of the days and settle in. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was his. And for now, that was enough. The days continued to drift by in the quiet rhythm that Jack had come to embrace. The small town, with its soft hum of life, became his sanctuary. Each morning, he would sit on his porch, the world unfolding in front of him like a slow-moving river, and he would just watch. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt the weight of his past finally beginning to fade into something manageable, something distant. One morning, as he sat sipping his coffee, the sound of a car pulling up broke the usual calm. Jack looked up, expecting to see a neighbor or perhaps the mailman. But it was neither. The car stopped, and a familiar face stepped out. The reporter. She had come back. For a moment, Jack debated whether or not to engage. He wasn't in the mood for interviews or long-winded discussions about his past. But something in her demeanor, the way she looked at him, there was a certain respect there now that hadn't been there before. She walked slowly toward the porch, her footsteps measured. Jack didn't stand. He didn't need to. Mr. Miller, she said as she reached the steps, her tone a little softer this time. I hope I'm not disturbing you again. Jack set his coffee down and motioned for her to sit, his face unreadable. You're fine, he said, his voice steady. She sat down beside him, the familiar notebook still in her hands. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the wind rustling through the trees and the distant murmur of town life continuing as usual. I've been thinking about what you said. She finally spoke, her voice low. About how some stories are better left untold. And I get it now. I do. But there's a part of me that feels like the world needs to know. People need to understand that what you did, what so many did, isn't just something to be forgotten. It's something that shapes everything we have today. Jack looked at her then, his eyes steady but distant. The world doesn't need to understand everything, he said softly. Some things, they're too heavy for others to carry. You think you want to know, but you don't. Not really. She looked at him, her eyes searching for something in his expression. Maybe not. But I think people need to hear about the quiet strength. The kind of strength that doesn't make the headlines, but still carries the weight of everything. The kind of strength that doesn't boast, doesn't ask for anything. Just does. Jack remained silent for a moment, his gaze drifting over the town that had become his refuge. He had never been one to seek recognition, never wanted the spotlight. The quiet life had always suited him. You're right, he said finally, his voice soft. But some things, some stories, belong to the past. And that's where they stay. The reporter nodded, a small smile touching her lips. I understand, she said, standing up to leave. Thank you, Mr. Miller. For everything. Jack watched her walk back to her car, the sound of her footsteps growing fainter as she disappeared down the road. He sat back in his chair, his eyes focused on the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. It was a peaceful evening, just like so many before. And Jack, in that quiet moment, felt a rare sense of contentment. The world had moved on without him, and maybe that was for the best. Maybe some stories were better left untold. But for Jack, the ones that mattered, the ones that shaped him, were already tucked away in the corners of his mind, where they would remain for as long as he needed them. Weeks passed, and the quiet routine Jack had built for himself continued uninterrupted. The small town, the soft rhythm of daily life, had become his world. It was a simple existence, but Jack had come to appreciate its simplicity. He woke each day with the same quiet sense of purpose, knowing that today would be much like yesterday. No surprises, no disruptions, just peace. But even in this peaceful existence, the past had a way of creeping in, of reminding him that there were things left undone, stories left untold. One morning, as Jack was sitting on his porch with his coffee, his mind wandered back to the days when he was known by his call sign, when the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Back then, he had never imagined a life like this, a life where the hardest decision he had to make was what to have for breakfast. The memories, though faded, still lingered in the corners of his mind. And yet, as the years went by, they became less sharp, less urgent. He had found a way to live with them, to compartmentalize them. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text. Message from an unknown number. Jack hesitated before opening it, unsure of who it might be. When he finally did, he saw that it was the reporter. "Mr. Miller, I know you've made it clear that you don't want to talk about your past, but I wanted to let you know that your story is still out there. It's not forgotten. People are still looking for it. I'm still looking for it. If you ever change your mind, I'll be here." Jack stared at the message for a long moment. It was exactly what he had expected. She was persistent, but in her persistence, there was a respect, an understanding that he didn't often find in others. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of the reminders, tired of the past creeping in. He set his phone down without replying, not because he didn't appreciate her effort, but because he knew his answer hadn't changed. The past was his to carry, and that was where it would stay. As the day went on, Jack continued with his usual routine. He took a walk through the neighborhood, nodding politely to the people he passed, but never engaging too much. The world was moving, changing, but Jack remained the same. He had long ago accepted that this was where he belonged now, in this quiet, unremarkable life. That evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, Jack sat on his porch once more. The warmth of the day was fading, and the cool air of the evening settled in. He felt a sense of calm wash over him, the kind of peace that only comes when you've made your peace with the world. The phone buzzed again, and this time, Jack didn't even glance at it. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered more than this moment. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt completely at ease, knowing that the past, no matter how it tried to reach him, was just that, the past. And the present, the quiet life he had built, was enough. As the days slipped into weeks, Jack found himself easing further into the life he had chosen. The routine that had once felt like an escape had now become his comfort. The mornings were quiet, the afternoons stretched out lazily, and the nights were a slow descent into peace. There were no more unexpected visitors, no more reporters or people trying to pull him back into the past. Jack had made it clear that his story was his own, and he had no interest in sharing it. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past truly lift. One cool evening, as Jack sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't unexpected, but it still caught him off guard. The reporter. She had come back. He didn't move at first, just watched her car roll to a stop and the door open. She got out, a notebook in hand, the same respectful demeanor she had before. She paused, glancing toward the porch, and Jack felt a brief moment of hesitation. This time, there was no rush to meet her. There was no sense of obligation. He had nothing left to prove. As she made her way up the steps, Jack stood slowly, his hand resting on the back of the chair. She reached the porch and stood for a moment, her eyes meeting his, as though searching for something in the silence between them. "Mr. Miller," she said softly, her voice carrying the same warmth as it had before. "I know you've made it clear you don't want to talk, but I couldn't leave things like this. I just wanted to tell you, your story hasn't been forgotten. It's still out there, in the hearts of people who understand. I want to thank you for everything." Jack stood still for a long moment, not saying anything. Her words weren't new. He had heard similar ones from people in the past, people who thought they knew what his life meant. But this time, there was something different in her voice. There was no pleading, no pressure to reopen old wounds. She had simply come to acknowledge him, to show that she understood. "You've already thanked me," Jack said, his voice steady. "And that's enough." The reporter nodded, a small, almost sad smile appearing on her face. "I know. I just needed to say it. For myself. I hope you understand." Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step forward, his gaze shifting to the fading light in the distance. For a brief moment, it felt like the weight of everything, the years, the battles, the silence, had all found their place in the world. "I understand," he said quietly. "But some things, some stories, they don't need to be told. Not anymore." She didn't argue. She simply stood there, watching him as the quiet stretched between them. After a moment, Jack turned back to the house, his hand resting on the door. "Good night," he said, and with that, she turned and left, her footsteps fading into the night. Jack stood there for a long time, the cool air brushing against his face, the weight of his past and present settling around him like a familiar cloak. The world would keep moving. People would keep living their lives, but Jack had already made his peace. The past was behind him. The future was his to choose. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the freedom of that choice.